On March 25th, 1911, 146 people died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the workers were finishing up for the day. Most of the employees were women that were either Italian or Jewish immigrants. They worked 52 hours a week, and they were paid around $7 to $12 per week. It's not $7 to $12 an hour, not a day. $7 to $12 a week. In today's dollars, that $7 to $12 a week translates into around anywhere between $3.50 to $6 an hour. The workers were not allowed to go on a break, to go outside, catch their breath, or to get a smoke. They were locked in for the entirety of the day while they worked because the people who ran the factory were concerned that they might be stealing. And so they locked them in from the outside. So when some of the cloth in that factory caught fire, there was nowhere for these workers to go. Now, the factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building. And so the workers, when they tried to escape the smoke and the flames that were billowing up, went to those windows and waited out and hung on the ledges until the fire department arrived. And a lot of them couldn't hold on and wait that long. When the fire department did finally arrive, they set up nets to catch those who would jump from those floors, and they found that the distance was too great, and the nets made no difference. So, one woman went to the ledge, opened up her purse, threw out the few bits of coins and bills that she had in there out into the street, and jumped, throwing off her brimmed hat into the crowd before she did so. There was a young man who helped 3 different women get to the ledge in order to have them jump. And when the 4th woman was hoisted up, she put her arms around him and gave him a kiss and then jumped. And he followed her. And Frances Perkins got to witness all of this. Frances Perkins was a woman who came from good middle-class stock for the early 1900s. She held a bachelor's degree in chemistry and science and a master's degree in political science. She was attending an afternoon tea with her friends when they saw the fire trucks and they wanted to go investigate what was happening. And watching those people struggle for their lives and fail changed Frances Perkins forever. That was the moment that she decided to dedicate her life to workers' rights. Now, Miss Perkins was no stranger to advocating for better working conditions before the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. She had led the New York office of the National Consumers League, where she worked for better working conditions, worked for better wages for women, worked to improve child labor laws, and to fight against workplace fire hazards. She was no stranger to the awful conditions that laborers faced for her time. It was her belief that those poor workers and how they were treated, that was part of the reason the economy wasn't doing so well in the 1900s. So she had been doing this work already, but something changes when you witness tragedy firsthand. It's no longer something that happens to other people. It's no longer a story in the news or a newspaper headline that gets dwarfed the next day. When you witness it firsthand, it becomes real in a way you could never imagine. When Frances Perkins witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, she was 31 years old. Now, for a lot of people, entering your 30s is that time when you become a little less idealistic and maybe a little bit more realistic in the ways of the world. Maybe you slow down your fighting against injustices. Maybe you don't. Frances Perkins certainly didn't slow down after that moment. She often credits that moment as strengthening her conviction in the work of workers' rights. Frances started working with local government officials, convincing them slowly to start passing laws that protected the labor force. Her efforts became more successful, and as they did so, she became more known and received more attention within those in the state. And she started to receive different state appointments. In 1929, she became the first commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor. And she was appointed personally by the newly elected governor of New York, a gentleman named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Roosevelt became president of the United States, Perkins joined him as the secretary of the labor force, the Labor Department. She was the first woman to serve on a presidential cabinet, the first woman to be in line for the succession of the presidency. And she was instrumental in the New Deal that FDR proposed. Perkins helped to draft the Social Security Act, was instrumental in legislature ensuring a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, a 2-day weekend, overtime laws, child labor laws, and welfare. If you're able to take this Labor Day off, you can thank Frances Perkins. And if you're able to take this Labor Day off, take a moment to remember the 146, mostly women, who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. That is, after all, what this weekend is about. Labor Day is about the people who move the economy of our nation. This holiday started in the late 1800s, about the same time the country's economy was moving from agricultural to industrial. How we worked was changing, and just like any other change, there was some grumbling at first. So we created Labor Day to make the change seem less scary, a reason to celebrate. But changes in a system also can lead to abuse. People aren't sure how the rules should be, and so maybe they don't necessarily play within the rules of morality. It was common back then to lock factory doors to prevent workers from stealing at the turn of the century. Child labor laws weren't frowned upon at the turn of the century because children had already been in the workforce. In an agricultural economy, children help out in the fields all the time. These things happened, all of these changes, because industry was new and they had no idea how to run factories. The owners of these factories were only interested in one thing: making a profit. And when it came to workers, there was a large pool of immigrants for them to choose from. They were workers who were expendable. And if they wanted better jobs, then you can go find them. 100 years ago, approximately, our country moved from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And today, our economy is facing another change. We're moving from an industrial economy to a service economy. So according to the U.S. Department of Labor, the very same department that Frances Perkins herself once headed, 41% of the U.S. workforce is classified as either management or professional. So those would be your professors, your social workers, librarians, nurses, doctors, lawyers, heck, even your ministers. 49% of the workforce Sales, service, administrative staff. That would be your cashiers, your waiters, prep cooks, nurses' assistants, hotel housekeepers, baristas, data entry, customer service, and other jobs similarly made. The other 10% of the remaining U.S. workforce, by the way, is transportation workers, construction, farmer, and other natural resource jobs. There are fewer professionals in the U.S. workforce currently at 41% than there are laborers in this country at 49%. And just like 100 years ago, we're trying to figure out what a fair and just workplace looks like. So let's start with the idea of that federal minimum wage. It's currently $7.25 an hour. So that means if you work 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year, you will make $15,080. And that's before taxes. Can any one of us live on $15,000 a year, especially in the Northern Virginia area? I very much doubt that. But that's what the minimum wage is supposed to do. It's supposed to allow people to have a comfortable living. FDR said regarding the minimum wage that no business which depends for existence on paying less than a living wage to its workers has any right to continue in this country. By business, we mean all of business, commerce as well as industry. And by workers, we mean all of the workers, the laborers in the machine shops as well as the cashiers and our baristas. And by a living wage, we mean more than just scraping by. The minimum wage isn't about teenage workers and seasonal help. It's about giving anyone who works an opportunity to have a decent life, to treat them with the worth and dignity they deserve. I'm sure many of you have heard about the Fight for 15 movement. It's a group that supports the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour. And if you do the math, the simple $15 an hour is not even enough. A one-bedroom apartment in the Arlington area is just over $2,000 a month. Say your utilities are around $200 a month. Health insurance and premiums are $220 a month, $300 a month for groceries, and let's say $250 a month for a car payment and insurance. That puts you at $2,970 a month in those expenses alone. And guess how much you need to make per hour to make that much a month? It's not even $15, it's $18.57. And notice that in those bits that we included, we didn't include things like Netflix, Starbucks. We didn't even include cell phone service, internet providers. We didn't include any clothing expenses, let alone gasoline for your car. And childcare, forget about childcare, that's an extra $400 a month if you're willing to leave your child at one of the low-rated, non-accredited childcare providers. Heck, in those numbers, I didn't even include federal and state taxes. Whether or not you agree with the idea of a $15 minimum wage, we can all agree that $7.25 just isn't enough. But what about other modern workplace abuses? Let's talk about sick days. While different employers have different standards about the number of sick days and when you can use them, many low-wage employers make it very difficult to call in sick. Often, they require a doctor's note from employees, which, in their mind, it will deter people from calling in sick by asking them for a doctor's note. But what it really does is it makes people sick come into work when they shouldn't. The insurance plans that many low-wage income earners have is so poor that they can't afford to go in because of the copay. So they don't take that day off for that head cold when they should just rest. And what happens when they go into work? They infect everyone. And in this time, that's the last thing we want anyone to do. And if you're a parent who works in a low-wage job and you have a child that calls in sick, you have to use your sick days for them. Because any child care or public school will not take a child if they have a fever. This is why we see people giving their children ibuprofen and sending them off to school so they can work. And I can tell you, employers don't like it when you call in sick for a child. Let me tell you a story from personal experience. So about 12 years ago or so, I was working for this small company that bought and sold used camera equipment. They had just under 50 employees, which if you know anything about some of the labor laws, if you have under 50 employees, there's a lot of the larger business labor laws you don't have to adhere to. My daughter at the time, Willow, was about 3 years old, and like 3-year-olds do, she'd gotten sick at daycare. She had some sort of head cold of some sort. She was a little snotty, a little under the weather. So Wendy and I knew that one of us had to stay home with her, and that fell to me. The reason being was that my wife was a public school teacher at the time. She was salaried and she had full benefits. Out of the two jobs, which one was more important to our family unit? Hers was the most important, both financially and, let's face it, educating children's a little bit more important than selling used camera equipment. So we decided she should be the one who stays at work and I stay home. On the second day, Willow wasn't quite bouncing back, so we took her to the pediatrician. And the pediatrician, she told us that Willow was a little dehydrated, and it was probably best if we had her hospitalized for a couple of days. Nothing serious. Well, it was serious enough for us at the time. She was our first, our only at the time. And hospitalization was kind of a major thing for us, and we felt we needed to stay with her. Kind of important. Who was going to stay with Willow? Again, it's going to be me. Much to my wife's chagrin, she did not want to be away from her little girl. After a couple of days in the hospital, Willow recovered like a trooper, and I went back to work, and I had my doctor's note. I had to have my doctor's note to let them know that I really was at the hospital with my daughter. And then for the next 2 years while I was working with this company, every performance review I got stellar marks, exceeds expectations across the board. But I never got a raise. And I never got promoted. And the reason why, they told me, they literally said this to me, is that since I took so much time off for my sick daughter, I was not a company man, and they could not depend on me. I can't imagine what it's like to be a woman in that situation. This is why women don't get promoted. And I also have to say that if I worked in some other companies like McDonald's and other places where they have high turnover, if I would have taken that second day off, there's a good chance I would have been fired like that. Retail service workers now, there are a lot of similarities to what they go through and what happened 100 years ago with Frances Perkins and the factory workers back then. Our service employees now are overworked, underpaid. If anyone goes to a store now, you know they're put in dangerous conditions due to COVID-19. And they are considered easy to replace by those who hire them. Easier to replace than protect. And that's why we need today a modern Frances Perkins. So some of you may have realized by today's sermon and by the Time for All Ages I did a couple of months ago that Frances Perkins is a bit of a personal hero of mine. Not only was Frances Perkins an amazing individual in a time where women were not even allowed to vote. She found a way to affect change. She used the connections that she had in her life and her incredible talent and her tenacity to bring about changes for other people. But for me, the most amazing thing about Frances Perkins was that she saw pain and suffering of others, and she allowed herself to be changed by it. She allowed what she saw to call her to action. This is what Labor Day should be about. It's not just a celebration of the labor forces. It's a call to action, a time to witness the injustices that our modern labor market can perpetuate. We need to make sure that everyone who works is treated with respect, worth, and dignity. That everyone who works can afford a decent house without having to share it with 3 other roommates, that they can afford decent food, that they can afford clothing, that they can afford to treat themselves once in a while to the small things like a monthly cup of Starbucks coffee or a Netflix subscription, the small things in life that make those downtime moments enjoyable. We should be able to support a wage that allows people not just the bare minimum to survive, but enough to thrive. So who's going to be our next Frances Perkins? Who's going to be our next charismatic, empowered leader to bring about justice for the working classes? Obviously, it's not going to be one particular person. Obviously, you know, I'm going to say it has to be all of us. We all have to act in the name of justice for those who labor. And some of the things that we can do are to make sure that we vote. Some of the smaller county elections, we need to make sure we have people who support workers' rights, who support unionizing cashiers and other service industry workers. We need to make sure that people support a living wage, not just $7.25 an hour. Another thing we can do is to make sure that we shop at businesses that we know treat their employees well. And it's not that hard to figure out by just taking a look at how the employees are, reading a few articles. And I want to let you know that shopping local is a great way to do that, but please be careful. Not every local business treats their employees well. I know this from very personal experience. The world we live in, the country we live in, especially the Northern Virginia area, tends to define people by what they do. So often the first question we ask someone when we meet them is, "What do you do for a living?" And I would love for the people that run our cashiers, for the baristas out there, for the waitresses and the waiters, for everyone, no matter what their job, I'd like for them to be able to answer that question, "What do you do?" proudly, knowing that their work is recognized as important, necessary, needed. After all, that's about 50% of our workforce in this country. These are the jobs that our everyday lives interact with. These are the jobs that make us comfortable, and we need to recognize them as important. Because the people who do these jobs deserve every single ounce of respect and dignity as anyone else. Happy Labor Day. May it be so.